Welcome to Obscura. We are cartographers of the forgotten, tracing the outlines of histories that were never meant to be found. We don't just tell stories, we exhume them. Tonight, we venture into the heart of the English countryside, to a place where the stone walls hold whispers and the soil has a long, long memory. This isn't a tale that begins with a crime. It begins with an absence. A silence so profound it became a sound in itself. This is the story of the Higgins family and the village of Ashworth, a community that chose to feed its shadows to keep its streets in the light. Our story opens not with a scream, but with a chill, a deep, penetrating cold that settled over Ashworth in December of 1965. It was a cold that stilled the world. The wind, usually a constant companion whistling through the hedgerows, fell silent. Birds didn't sing that morning. They watched. The first thread of the tapestry began to unravel at the doorstep of a cottage known as Ivy Green. The milkman, Arthur Peel, found his delivery from the previous day untouched. 4 bottles, lined with military precision, now wore jackets of frost. No empties waited for collection. No footprints marred the fresh snow leading to the door, just that perfect, undisturbed row of glass gleaming coldly in the weak dawn light. By midday, a low hum of unease passed between neighbors over garden fences. By nightfall, a young constable named Peter Evans stood in the Higgins parlor, his torch beam trembling, not from the cold, but from a feeling he couldn't name. The house was a photograph of interrupted life. A half-eaten meal sat congealing on the table. A radio hummed static to an empty room. A mother's knitting lay abandoned on an armchair, the needle poised mid-stitch. Beds were slept in but never made. It was as if the entire family, father, mother, and their 4 children, had simply dissolved into the atmosphere. Yet, something was wrong in the details. The air didn't smell of dust and neglect, but of damp stone and cold earth, as if the foundations had breathed inward. And on the hallway mirror, someone had drawn a single crude spiral in the condensation. A child's doodle, perhaps. But it felt like a symbol, a final futile message. The vanishing was a mystery. But what the village began to remember in the weeks that followed was the true horror. The strange sermons at St. Jude's Church, delivered by Reverend Alistair Crow, the odd symbols chalked on gate posts, the way the Higgins children had slowly ceased to make eye contact, their laughter replaced by a quiet, watchful dread. Before we descend further into the darkness beneath Ashworth, I want to speak directly to you. This channel is a sanctuary for those who are not afraid to look into the abyss, knowing the abyss is already looking back. If you are still listening, you understand that some truths are not puzzles to be solved, but wounds to be acknowledged. So, if you have the courage, subscribe and join our community of seekers. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Could a story like this be sleeping in the soil of your own hometown? Because the story of the Higgins family does not begin with their disappearance. It begins with a community that saw the cracks forming and chose to look away. The first real break in the case came from a loose floorboard in the bedroom of the eldest Higgins child, 14-year-old Eleanor. Hidden beneath it was a diary, its green leather cover cracked with age. The early pages were mundane: schoolyard gossip, a little brother's mischief, the creeping chill of an English autumn. But as the entries marched toward December, the ink grew frantic, the tone paranoid. October 12th. Mother was in the garden again after midnight, whispering to the rose bushes. I saw her draw a circle in the dirt with her bare hands. She stood there for an age, not moving. The cold didn't seem to touch her. November 3rd. Father has put a new lock on the cellar door. He says it's to keep the damp out, but I hear things down there. Not rats, not the pipes. Voices, low and chanting. The final entry, dated just 5 days before the family vanished, was the most chilling. I asked Reverend Crow why we don't celebrate Christmas like we used to. He didn't smile. He looked right through me and said, "Some traditions require a different kind of gift, child. A quieter gratitude." I don't like the way he looks at us. I don't like it at all. Tucked into the back of the diary was a child's drawing. 6 stick figures stood around a large spiral. One was drawn upside down. Hanging above them in the sky was a symbol the local police couldn't identify. On the back, scrawled in red crayon in a shaky, unpracticed hand, were 3 words: "They chose us." The local constabulary dismissed it as the ramblings of a frightened girl. But the lead investigator, Detective Inspector Samuel Thorne, felt a cold knot of recognition tighten in his stomach. He'd seen that spiral before, in a classified Scotland Yard briefing on historical folk cults. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a ward, a symbol of protection from something ancient and malevolent, often associated with rituals of appeasement. But who had drawn it, and what had the family been chosen for? The deeper Thorne dug, the more Ashworth closed ranks. Doors that were once open now remained shut. The Reverend had suddenly left on a sabbatical. Lifelong neighbors now claimed they barely knew the Higgins. Their silence wasn't just protective, it was thick with a fear so old it had curdled into tradition. This brings us to the village's spiritual leader, Reverend Alistair Crowe. To an outsider, he was the picture of pastoral gentility. Tall, softly spoken, immaculately dressed. But there was a rehearsed quality to his kindness, a smile that never reached his cold, unblinking eyes. He had arrived in Ashworth in the shadow of the Second World War, a man with a clean past and vague references. He was gentle with the children, and his sermons were initially comforting. But over time, they began to change. He spoke less of salvation and more of sacrifice, less of a loving God and more of a demanding land. He ceased using the Bible altogether, instead reading from a worn, black-bound tome with no title. When asked about it, he would simply smile and say, "This text is older than sin. It is the first truth." One parishioner, Agatha Bell, now in her 90s, recalled a sermon from that final year. He spoke of cleansing the rot from the garden, of offering up the blight to save the harvest. Everyone just nodded along. I looked around the pews and thought, am I the only one hearing this madness? But no one ever challenged him. Not ever. And then there were the special services, held at night, by invitation only. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's would be locked, but those who lingered nearby swore they could hear a low, rhythmic chanting that felt older than the church itself. When Thorne finally went to confront Crowe at the vicarage, he found the place empty. The study had been stripped. Documents smoldered in the fireplace. The chapel pews were overturned. And in the center of the altar, a circle of black ash had been drawn. The only thing that remained was a message, carved deep into the inside of the chapel door. The gate is sealed. The offering is complete. Thorne's investigation was now a ghost hunt, but his next discovery would give that ghost a physical form. Behind the altar, hidden by a false panel, his team found a narrow hatch leading to a spiral staircase that shouldn't have existed. The air that rose from below was frigid and carried a cloying metallic sweetness. At the bottom, a reinforced oak door stood sentry, its surface marred by deep, frantic grooves, as if someone had tried to claw their way out from the other side. When they forced it open, they found a chamber that defied all reason. It was circular, its walls covered in carvings of spirals, eyes, and stitched shut mouths. In the center was a shallow stone basin, stained a deep, indelible black. But it was the objects arranged around it that stole the breath from Thorne's lungs. Children's toys, a worn wooden soldier, a hand-sewn doll with yarn for hair, a small lace-trimmed bonnet darkened with age, and a hair ribbon with the initials E. H embroidered in blue thread. Eleanor Higgins. Forensic testing would later confirm these items belonged to the missing children. But the chamber's horror was only beginning to reveal itself. There were dozens of other items, a tiny leather shoe, a set of iron teeth, a silver rattle, that did not belong to the Higgins family. Thorne's team began cross-referencing cold cases. A terrifying pattern emerged. For decades, Ashworth had a history of missing persons. Vagrants, runaways, drifters, all vanishing within a 2-mile radius of St. Jude's. The chamber was not new. It was ancient. Carbon dating suggested it was a pre-Christian site, a place of chalk and sacrifice, later sanctified and sealed by the church. And then they found the ledger. It was small, bound in a material later confirmed to be human skin, hidden in a niche behind the altar. Written in a bastardized form of Old English and Latin, it contained dates, names, and precise ritual instructions. And on every page, the same chilling refrain, "We give so the earth does not take." The investigation now turned to the town's power structure, the Ashworth Heritage Trust. On the surface, a benign society of elderly volunteers who organized garden parties and preserved local architecture. But Thorne discovered they owned half the village through a web of shell companies. Its members included the doctor, the head mistress, the bank manager, and Thorne's own former superior, Chief Constable Albert Vance, who had quietly shut down the initial Higgins inquiry. Thorne, acting on an anonymous tip, secured a warrant for the trust's private archive beneath the town library. What his team found there was a damning chronicle of organized evil. Boxes of records, some centuries old, detailing a practice called the tithe of the soil. An offering required every decade to ensure the village's prosperity. An entry from 1965 read, "The land trembles, the harvest weakens. A full family, blooded and bound, shall be returned to the root." And there were photographs. Reverend Crowe in ceremonial robes, the Higgins twins, their eyes vacant, standing beside a wooden altar. A group of 12 solemn-faced men and women in formal wear gathered around the stone basin. They were pillars of the community. They were keepers of a monstrous secret. The trust wasn't just involved. They were the architects. From behind a facade of charity and tradition, a hidden council had enforced a pact that stretched back to the Norman conquest. Every one of them had sworn the same oath. "We preserve so the ground stays quiet." Thorne knew he was walking into a viper's nest. His requests for backup were mysteriously delayed. His reports were flagged, his evidence lost. So he took a monumental risk. He went to the press. He shared everything with an investigative journalist named Catherine Reed, known for her fearlessness. Her article, "The Blood Pact of Ashworth," exploded across the front pages. National media descended. The church was sealed. The wall of silence began to crack. That's when Thorne's life was turned inside out. His car was vandalized. His wife received an anonymous note. "The roots are deep. So are the graves." He was suspended from duty on a pretext. But the truth was now too big to bury. A public inquiry was launched, and one by one, the old guard began to break. The village undertaker, a man named Walter Griggs, confessed. He described the night the Higgins family was led to the chamber, dressed in white linen. But his most horrifying revelation was that this was not the first time. "Every generation," he whispered, his voice trembling, "we gave them to the ground. We were told if we stopped, the land would sicken, and death would come for us all." His confession triggered a wave of arrests. But most of the accused never saw a trial. They died under suspicious circumstances. Suicides, sudden illnesses, their secrets dying with them. Thorne's work had cracked the foundation, but it would be historians and archaeologists who would unearth the bedrock of the horror. Ashworth, they discovered, was built on a pagan druidic site known as Aesk Worth, the place of the ash sacrifice. Beneath St. Jude's, beneath even the ritual chamber, they found a much older temple. A circular stone table, blackened by 1,000 years of fire, surrounded by carvings of chained human figures. This was not a perversion of faith. It was the faith itself, a belief that the land was a living, hungry entity that demanded payment for protection. The Black Death had hardened the pact. The land must drink that which thinks. The Ashworth Heritage Trust was merely the latest custodian of this ancient, bloody contract. And the Higgins family? They were not random victims. Land records showed they were invited to Ashworth, their cottage leased by the church for a pittance. Edward Higgins's job as groundskeeper had never been publicly advertised. He was chosen by name. A deeper look into the adoption records of the two youngest Higgins children revealed a sinister pattern. They were part of a quiet, selective placement program that funneled certain children into specific rural communities, villages like Ashworth marked on internal lists as preservation zones. The Higgins family was a constructed sacrifice, a perfect, isolated, God-fearing unit designed to be erased. In their final days, something in them had shifted. Neighbors reported Edward Higgins digging frantically behind the church at night. The children were seen burning family photographs. Mary Higgins appeared in public with bruises on her arms and a vacant stare. A journal, hidden in a toy chest and discovered years later, contained Edward's desperate entries. "They lied to us. This was never about faith. The prayers are older than God. Mary says we must play along, but I see it in their eyes. We are the harvest. The children dream of a man at the window. I tell them it's a nightmare, but I've seen him too. It's not just the reverend. It's the baker, the schoolmaster, the constable. We trusted them all." The final entry, written the night before they vanished, contained a sentence that would haunt the case forever. "They say the last offering failed. If we do not comply, it will be worse. Mary refuses to run. She says it is too late. I don't know what to do, but I buried the first one deep." Excavations later revealed a small skeleton behind the church, a child, no older than 3, a sacrifice that predated their own. The full monstrous truth was now clear. Ashworth's rot was not an infection. It was the foundation, a generational, institutionalized evil, camouflaged by ceremony and protected by fear. Detective Inspector Thorne, though suspended, had become a reluctant hero. His evidence forced a reckoning. The trust was dissolved. Properties were seized. The world knew the name Ashworth, but Thorne himself vanished shortly after the inquiry concluded. His car was found abandoned, his bank accounts untouched, just a single handwritten note left on his desk. They can't bury what's already rooted in the bone. Some say he was silenced. Others believe he is still out there watching, waiting for the next crack in the earth to appear. Because the most chilling question remains: did the rituals truly stop, or did they simply learn to hide in a different kind of silence? Ashworth is a ghost town now. The church is gone. The cottages are ruins. But the bell from St. Jude's remains, locked in a diocesan vault. No one wants to hear it ring again. The official record calls it closed. But those who remember, those who listen to the whispers in the soil, know better. Evil of this magnitude does not die. It hibernates. It waits. It remembers the taste of sacrifice. Host, V.O. So what do we take from this? That darkness does not always announce itself with a roar. Often it arrives with a smile, a handshake, and a donation to the local fete. It wraps itself in the respectable cloth of tradition and dares you to question its authority. The story of Ashworth is not a relic. It is a warning, a reminder that the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is sleeping beneath our feet, waiting for us to forget, waiting for us to stop listening to the whispers in the soil. If you have listened this far, you are now part of keeping that memory alive. You have looked into the abyss, and in doing so, you have denied it the silence it craves. This is Obscura. Remember what others would rather you forget. Scene end.